Annenberg Media.
In the global economy, national borders can be gateways for workers and investment capital. What makes workers look for work and investors seek out opportunities in foreign countries? Labor and capital mobility. What makes them move? We'll find out when we look inside the global economy.
Hello, this is Annenberg. In this segment of Inside the Global Economy, we're going to be talking about capital and labor mobility. The U.S. is a nation of immigrants. Many Americans like myself are first, second, or third generation immigrants. But it's not just people who move, but capital also moves. What's interesting is capital is invisible, so you don't always see the full impact of it, but it's there and it's a powerful integrating force in the global economy. Why do capital and labor move? And what's the impact on the host and the home countries? We're going to answer these questions by looking at two case studies, one in Europe and one in Mexico. We'll also hear from a panel of experts who'll give us their views on some of these issues. But let's first look at some of the terms that we're going to be using here. What is labor and capital mobility? Well, any movement of labor, workers, or capital, money, across national boundaries, which is motivated either by socio-political, religious, cultural, or economic reasons, is referred to as capital or labor mobility. Why are these movements important? At least a couple of reasons that need to be pointed out. The first, they are powerful integrating forces in the global economy, and not only recently, but in the 19th century and also earlier than that. Second, very important point, they can substitute or complement trade, the movement of goods. So the movement of capital and labor is very closely interconnected with the movement of goods. And we need to elaborate on this a little bit because I think it helps to make the points fairly clearly. Let's use a couple of examples here. First, oftentimes, developed countries especially, have a choice between importing cheap, labor-intensive goods from developing countries or allowing waves of immigrants from those very same countries. Conversely, another way of saying it is often producers in developed or industrial countries complain about cheap foreign imports, but are perfectly happy to hire cheap migrant workers. So you can see that in a relationship. Let's see if we can illustrate some of these points about the substitutability of trade on the one hand and capital and labor mobility on the other using a numerical example. And in this example, we're going to be looking at tomato growers in Mexico and in the U.S. And we're going to put in a few simplifying assumptions. The first is that land in the U.S. and Mexico are equally productive. The second is that the workers in the two countries can each pick 2 bushels per hour of tomatoes. The third is that the transportation cost between the two countries is 75 cents per bushel. Now for the interesting and important assumptions, labor costs and capital costs. In the U.S., the cost of picking 1 bushel of tomatoes is $1.25 a bushel. That reflects the higher wages in the U.S. In Mexico, it's 25 cents per bushel. The opposite is true in terms of capital costs. Capital costs refer to seeds, fertilizer, machinery. In this instance, the U.S. costs are lower, 30 cents per bushel, whereas in Mexico, the capital costs are 50 cents per bushel. Now, what this reflects is that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in capital-intensive goods, goods that require a lot of capital, whereas Mexico has a comparative advantage in labor-intensive goods, goods that have a large labor content. Now, we're going to run through 3 scenarios that will show us the impact of some of these assumptions on some of the discussions we were having earlier. The first scenario is that there is no trade and no movement of labor and capital between the two countries. In this situation, the tomato growing costs in the U.S. equal $1.55 per bushel, which reflects $1.25 for labor and 30 cents for the cost of capital. This is all per bushel. In Mexico, the tomato growing costs are 75 cents per bushel, which reflects 25 cents for labor, and 50 cents for capital. Now, again, in this scenario, there's no trade, no movement of capital and labor. So, in fact, the tomatoes that are grown in the U.S. are consumed in the U.S. The tomatoes that are grown in Mexico are consumed in Mexico. Now, let's change the assumptions and assume that trade now takes place between the two countries. And what we have to add in a new variable here, and that is the cost of transporting tomatoes from one country to the other. Here again, the cost of growing tomatoes in the U.S. is $1.55 per bushel, as we saw before, but the cost of importing tomatoes from Mexico to the U.S. is $1.50 a bushel. That reflects 75 cents to grow the tomatoes in Mexico, and then an additional 75 cents for the transportation cost to bring them into the U.S., the sum total of which is $1.50 per bushel, which is lower than the cost of actually producing the tomatoes in the U.S. So the conclusion here is that tomatoes will be imported from Mexico to the U.S. Now, of course, the corollary to this is that capital-intensive goods, like computers, aircraft, and so forth, will be exported from the U.S. to Mexico. So it's obviously not just a one-way street. Now, let's look at the third scenario, in which we don't allow any trade, so there's no trade, but we do allow capital and labor to move. Now, to allow capital, or to attract capital from the U.S. to Mexico, or vice versa, to attract labor from Mexico to the U.S., you have to pay them a somewhat higher wage or rate of return than they would normally get in their home country. So to get Mexican workers to cross the border, you have to pay them $1.15 to cover transportation costs, living expenses, and so forth. To get U.S. capital to move across the border to Mexico, you have to give it a higher rate of return, 40 cents per bushel, versus the 30 that it would get in the U.S. So that gives us a sense of what would have to be paid to either labor or capital to get them to move across the U.S.-Mexican border. Now, what's the result of this? Well, what's interesting is that the production costs in both U.S. and Mexico go down as a result of these movements. In the U.S. case, the production cost goes down to $1.45 per bushel. This reflects $1.15 for the Mexican labor coming into the U.S., plus the 30 cents a bushel for the U.S. capital costs. In Mexico, the cost has dropped to 65 cents a bushel because it's, again, 25 cents a bushel for the labor, but now it's only 40 cents a bushel for the capital that's coming from the U.S. So the bottom line here, the conclusion, is simply that just allowing capital and labor to move across the border, you've lowered the production costs on both sides of the border, and the net effect is to benefit both countries. So this is a very positive development, but it also illustrates the substitutability of trade and capital and labor flows. Now, we mentioned earlier that there's a complementary element in capital flows and labor flows and trade, and let's illustrate that by using an example here of a company like Chrysler moving across the border and building an auto assembly plant in Mexico. What happens after that is then Chrysler will be shipping, exporting as it were, parts of autos from the U.S. to Mexico. So trade, in effect, follows the investment. And this is often very true, whether it's Japanese investing in the U.S. or the U.S. investing in Mexico. So there's a complementary element, especially to capital flows and trade, as well as the substituting. All right, let's back up a little bit here and look at the different kinds of migration that it can occur around the world. There are basically two types, legal and illegal. We'll focus mostly on legal migration. Many of the issues on illegal migration are very similar. There are two types of legal migration. One is a permanent movement. In other words, somebody moves from one country to another and stays there. And then there's temporary movements where somebody will move to get a better job, but eventually will move back. Sometimes these are called guest workers. Now, as we look at the history on legal migration into the United States, we see that the U.S. went through a number of waves of migration in the 1800s and the early 1900s. That's fallen off in recent years, but interestingly enough, in the 80s and 90s, it's begun to pick up a little bit. Now, why do people move across borders? Well, there are a number of reasons. We've listed three very quickly here. Religious and political persecution was certainly a driving factor, let's say, in the 19th century for many European immigrants that came to the U.S. Wars are other events that will generate waves of migration. And the most recent reasons are economic reasons. A lot of the migration that has taken place into North America and Europe and so forth in the post-war period has been for economic reasons, namely higher earnings. And to illustrate this point, we go to our first case study, which illustrates the impact of Turkish migrant workers working in the Netherlands.
Scattered throughout the Turkish countryside are villages similar to this one, Adayazi. A conspicuous feature of the village is the absence of many young people and the presence of many old people and empty houses with closed shutters.
%90'ı göçtü.
90% of the villagers have left. They went to Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, France, and Belgium. They started leaving in 1966. Families left one by one. The women went later in 1974, 1975.
1974'lerde falan gitti.
How did that happen? Retired school teacher Oza.
Şimdi bir kere göçlerin sebebi şu. Evvelce köylerde
People emigrated because villages initially offered a limited means of income.
hayvancılık vardı.
Cattle breeding and small-scale arable farming. There was no other work.
Hayatı yoktu.
The prices farmers received for their produce were too low.
Alamıyordu. Hayvancı topladığı
Villagers started moving to the cities to improve their living standards. Other villagers followed when they noticed these changes.
başladı. Ama şehre giden hayat seviyesini yükseltti. Onu gören diğer köylüler de şehri boşaltmaya başladılar. Derken Avrupa yolu
At the same time, Turkish people started to emigrate to Europe. There was work for them in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. When they visited their native villages, the remaining villagers noticed their affluence, and they also moved to the cities or to Europe.
sonra bir taraftan şehirlere akım, bir taraftan
That's how some villages became deserted.
akın başladı. Böylece bazı köyler boşaldı.
The time was ripe. In Turkey and Morocco, long queues form in front of recruitment agencies, where Dutch recruitment agents select workers for companies that are crying out for extra staff. These shots were taken in 1969. At a glance, this Dutch government agent picks suitable candidates for the Dutch job market.
Momenteel behandel ik de aanvragen van een machinefabriek van 2 lassers.
At the moment, I'm recruiting 2 welders for an engineering works, 10 cleaners for a ship's cleaning company, 6 workers for a cement works, 10 men for a brickyard, and a factory for meat products wants another 20 workers. 2 weeks ago, I supplied them with 24 workers.
Geworven.
Many foreigners are employed at greenhouse nurseries in Western Holland, a grower.
Hier werken 8 mensen, waarvan 4 buitenlanders en 4 Nederlanders.
8 people work here, 4 foreigners and 4 Dutch people. We have 3 Turks and 1 Moroccan. We've employed people of Turkish origin for the past 15 to 17 years.
Daar wordt gewoon erg veel arbeid verricht. Dus veel
This work is very labor-intensive, so we need a lot of staff. This region can't supply our demands, so we recruit elsewhere, and foreigners apply for the jobs.
De buitenlandse mensen die komen op die vraag af.
There are over 300,000 unemployed people in Holland. Why don't they work in the greenhouses? For many of them, the job is too far away from home. For others, the kind of work is not attractive. And the wages for the mostly unskilled labor are low and sometimes hardly higher than an unemployment benefit. An officer of the employment exchange.
Als je natuurlijk een jonge man spreekt van bijvoorbeeld 18 jaar, die dan getrouwd is.
When, for example, you talk with a young married man of, let's say, 18 years old, in his case, the unemployment benefit is higher than the salary he gets in the nursery. So he thinks, why should I work?
Van ja, waarom zou ik überhaupt gaan werken?
Hassan Essoy came to Holland illegally in 1977. He planned to stay for 2 years to save for a car. He obtained legal status, married a Turkish woman, started a family, and still lives in Holland. Many foreigners stay on in Holland. Currently, foreigners make up 5% of the population in Holland.
You can earn a lot more money here. I could earn money where I came from. There are plenty of greenhouse nurseries there, but the wages are low. Doing the same work here means you can save money too.
A lot of these people's savings are used to build houses in Turkey. These are not just holiday homes, but also homes for the future, which explains all the empty houses in the village. But will the emigrants ever return to their native villages for good? Azat Akan has lived in the Netherlands for 25 years and is visiting his native village.
Kinderen willen niet terug hier. Kinderen niet meer terug is, ik ook ga niet terug.
My children don't want to live here, which prevents me coming back here too. The children were born in Holland, they went to school there, and they have their friends and colleagues there. They have no friends or colleagues here. It's difficult.
Dat is anders, een beetje moeilijk.
The greenhouse nursery sector suffers from chronic workforce shortages. Recruiting Dutch workers is virtually impossible, and the number of immigrants allowed into Holland has been drastically reduced. Isn't it obvious that illegal immigrants will offer their services?
Tot op zekere hoogte wel. Alleen wordt het natuurlijk...
That's true to a certain extent, but obviously it's difficult to recruit and maintain illegal immigrants in your workforce, because if you're caught, the fines are so high, and your company may even be closed down. I don't expect the situation to change in the long term, because these people need money, which we can provide if they work here.
En hier is geld te halen. En hier kunnen ze werken voor dat geld.
Şimdi imkanı olanlar, iş terbiyesi olanlar.
People who were educated and now work as doctors, engineers or teachers, and others who earn well, don't emigrate to Europe.
İnsanlar zaten şeye gitmiyorlar. Avrupa'ya gitmiyorlar. Çaresizlik içerisinde.
But when people don't receive education, become poor and needy and cannot find suitable work, they're forced to leave for Europe.
Ülkesinde iş alanı bulamazlarsa, kendi kafalarına yatkın iş alanı bulamazlarsa, o zaman uluslararası alanda kendilerine iş arama zorunluluğunda kalıyorlar.
Many people have left Adiyazi. They live in distant places such as Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands.
Emirdağ çapında yani bizim köyde elde.
Foreign currency has improved the village and made it more affluent. If all the inhabitants had stayed here, the village would have remained poor, but they left, which was better for those who stayed behind and for those who left.
Migration to Holland becomes more and more complicated. Nevertheless, it will continue. The drift from countries where jobs are hardly available to countries where there is a shortage of laborers. Migration, legally or illegally.
Some time ago, I was joined by some of my economics colleagues in Melbourne, Australia, to discuss this case study. They are Richard Snape of Monash University in Australia, Magnus Blomstrom of the Stockholm School of Economics, and Hervé Torres of the International Monetary Fund. Let's hear what they have to say about this case study.
Magnus, is worker mobility a win-lose or a win-win scenario?
Well, that depends, really. I mean, in the case of the Netherlands we've seen now, I think it's a win-win scenario, simply because the Netherlands would get cheap labor, and hopefully, or we know that to a large extent, these people send a lot of money back home again. So in that case, I think it's a win-win scenario. On the other hand, you can always think of situations where a government has invested, for instance, in education people. And if you get a lot of educated people leaving a country, particularly if it's a poor country, then you certainly might end up in a win-lose scenario.
I guess even then, of course, it depends to what extent those people who have left remit funds back. And if their earning capacity is hugely greater in the country to which they've moved, and in fact they're sending back substantial funds to the country from which they came, it may even then be better for the country from which they left it. But that perhaps is a fairly extreme situation.
But would it be dangerous for a country, say like Turkey, to become reliant on money being sent back from migrant workers?
Well, dangerous to become reliant. I suppose if you're too reliant on anything, it becomes dangerous. If they can be sure that that's continuing and that there's no danger of it suddenly being cut off. They can adjust their policies to it, and it's certainly going to increase the ability of Turkish people to live well, live better than they otherwise could. And it's not necessarily a dangerous situation, no.
In one sense, though, I guess the Turkish migrant workers are a source of vulnerability to Turkey because if and when, in fact, Germany went into a recession, many of the guest workers from Turkey and other countries were sent back. And so that created problems for Turkey in the sense that now they had more unemployed people on their doorstep again. So there is an increased vulnerability in that sense to the business cycles of the host country.
Well, I agree with that, and there's certainly a number of cases of that. We've got them in Singapore and Malaysia, for example. There's a strong movement of labour across the causeway from Malaysia to Singapore, and when the Singapore economy turns down, for example, in the early 80s it did, then their problems are to a large extent employment problems were solved by cutting off the supply and sending Malaysians back into Malaysia. In a sense, they exported the unemployment problem. And there are many examples of that. It certainly can be a problem in that sense.
The other thing that happens, this is especially true in the U.S., I suspect maybe to some extent in Australia as well, is a lot of the migrant workers work in jobs that the average American worker would really not want to do. They're menial jobs, they require sort of unskilled labor and so forth. So what you're finding is they're not necessarily filling up jobs that Americans might take anyway, but filling up those jobs that really the typical American doesn't want to do anymore.
Well, the Netherlands case study really illustrated that quite clearly, and the Turkish workers moving to the Netherlands, undertaking jobs which at the current wage rates, or the wage rates which were paid for those jobs, the Dutch workers weren't prepared to undertake. Now that was obviously a gain for the industry that was employing these workers, because otherwise they may have had to close down at the labour costs that would have been required to employ Dutch workers.
But was there a downside for the Netherlands?
In the Netherlands, there were social tensions. There's the problem, of course, of the illegals and, that have been referred to. And I suppose there was also competition with the lower end of the labour force in Holland. And at times this has brought resistance and reaction in a number of countries.
The principle back, though, to the notion of global free trade, what about Turkey? What about Mexico? To a degree, aren't they losing by not looking within, looking at domestic policies, looking to export, and thereby expanding their own economies?
Well, I guess that with respect to Turkey, one could think it might have been a very good idea if Turkey could have been exporting more products themselves, and which were demanded, and even some of the horticultural products like tomatoes, which may have been able to be exported from Turkey. That, of course, means that the importing countries have to open their markets to those products. And very often, markets are closed to those labour-intensive goods, which the workers would be able to produce in the countries from which they've come. And you've, in fact, got the movement of the labour as a substitute for the movement of the products. And it's a very good question as to say, wouldn't it be better to open the markets and to let the products of the workers flow instead of the workers?
What's interesting is that's the dilemma that's facing Western Europe vis-a-vis the Eastern Europeans right now. They have the same choice, open up their markets to Eastern European agricultural goods and textiles and so forth, or have to bear under the pressure of immigration, basically, where if these countries can't export the goods, then there's so many more people who are unemployed who then want to move to Western Europe. So that's the same kind of dilemma that they're facing.
Nariman, thank you very much.
As we saw in the case study, there are winners and losers when the Turkish workers moved to the Netherlands. Let's see if we can summarize who are the winners and losers when labor migration takes place. The clear winners are the migrants themselves. They move and they earn higher wages in the host country. And also the families of the migrant workers can also benefit because the migrant workers will send money back to the home country. These are called remittances. Another set of winners are the home country workers, those who stay behind, because what happens is as the pool of labor diminishes in the home country, in this case Turkey, their wages go up because there are fewer of them. So in that sense, they also benefit. Third, the host country employers benefit. In this instance, it's the companies or the growers in the Netherlands because they can tap into a large, less expensive pool of labor. What about the losers? Well, the home country employers are among the losers because here again, the labor pool in Turkey, in our example, has shrunk, the wage has gone up, so they tend to lose out as a result of that. And finally, the host country workers, the workers in the Netherlands in our case study, can also lose. Now, it's important to make a couple of qualifications here. The first is that not all the workers in the Netherlands lost out, largely because most of the immigrants coming in were unskilled workers. So it's only at the lower end of the income scale, in terms of unskilled workers in the Netherlands, that would suffer as a result of the migration. But the other pragmatic fact is that oftentimes migrant workers will take the jobs that the local workers, in this case the Dutch workers, really don't want to take. So the loss often to the host country workers is relatively small. Now let's see if we can illustrate some of these points using some graphical analysis. And we're going to look at the labor market in the US and in Mexico. This is the US labor market. What it represents is the supply and demand for labor in the US. The demand curve slopes from the top left to the bottom right. And what it says is as the wages of US workers go up, employers in the US, companies in the US, will employ fewer workers so that the demand goes down. On the other side of the market, the supply slopes upward from the bottom left to the top right. What this says is as the wage goes up, more people will be willing to work. Now, what this illustrates is the US labor market without any immigration. What happens when there is immigration? What happens is that the wage of the average worker in the US is now depressed because lower wage workers come in and they push the wage in the US down. In this instance, it goes from $5 an hour to $4.50 an hour. The impact of that is twofold. First, as the wage goes down, fewer people are willing to work in the US at that wage. So you move down the supply curve, as it were. But at the same time, as the wage goes down, as the cost of labor goes down, US companies are happy to employ more workers. So we move down the demand curve, as it were. And the net difference here is immigration. So 20 million immigrants are coming in at those wages to satisfy that difference between the supply and demand of US labor. Who are the winners and losers in this example in the US? Clearly, the winners in the US are the US employers, the US companies, because they have access to more workers at a lower wage, and this is represented by this shaded area in this graph. Who loses? Well, in this instance is US workers because they receive a lower wage, 50 cents less an hour, and there are fewer of them that are employed. So the loss here is the shaded area in terms of the loss to US workers. Let's switch gears and look at Mexico now. And this is the supply and demand for labor in Mexico. And notice that without outmigration, in other words, without migration to the north to the US, the wage in Mexico is $1.50 an hour, which is considerably lower than the wage in the US. Now, what happens when migration to the north to the US takes place? We can represent this by a leftward shift in the supply curve in Mexico, which means that for every wage rate that's paid in Mexico, there are fewer workers because they've headed north to the US. So that's the way we can represent this out-migration. Who wins and who loses in Mexico in this example? Well, clearly the winners are the migrants. That their gain is shown by this parallelogram here, which is basically the higher wage times the number of people who've headed to the US. So that measures the net gain to the migrants. Now, there's another group that also gains, and these are the workers that stay in Mexico, don't move, and they gain by getting a higher wage because there's a smaller pool of labor now in Mexico, and they can ask for and get a higher wage. Who are the losers in Mexico? Well, the losers in Mexico are Mexican employers, Mexican companies, because now they have fewer workers that they can hire, and they have to pay a higher wage, $2 an hour instead of $1.50 before. So this clearly illustrates the winners and losers in this particular market. Now, the net gain in Mexico and the U.S. turns out to be positive, and let's see if we can illustrate that. In Mexico, the net effect is that when you combine the gains of the migrants on the one hand and the workers in Mexico who stay behind but get a higher wage on the other hand, when you combine those two, those gains are more than the loss that Mexican employers suffer because they have fewer workers and have to pay them higher wages. So there's a net gain in Mexico shown by this triangle here. What about in the U.S.? Similarly, in the U.S., the gain that U.S. companies or employers enjoy because more workers at a lower wage, again, more than offsets the loss that U.S. workers suffer because of the lower wages. So there's a gain, a net gain in the U.S., a net gain in Mexico. Obviously, in each country, there are winners and losers, but the net effect is positive in both countries. And when you put them together, there's a net gain to the world at large. Now, let's look at some of the other impacts of labor migration on the host and the home countries. The first is the impact on the taxes and spending in both the home and the host countries. Let's look at both sides. First, as a worker moves from the home country, in our case study from Turkey, to the host country, the Netherlands, they take with them their wages, obviously. And so the tax base in the home country, Turkey, is depressed, whereas the tax base in Holland increases. So in that sense, the tax revenues in Turkey or the home country will fall, whereas they will increase in the host country or the Netherlands. But there's an offset here that occurs as well on the spending side, because for every worker that leaves Turkey, let's say, the requirement of the government to pay Social Security benefits or unemployment benefits goes down. So yes, tax revenues have gone down, but the need for spending has also gone down. Vice versa, in the Netherlands, yes, the tax base has increased because you've got more workers paying taxes, but also the need to pay those workers Social Security benefits or unemployment benefits also increases. So the net effect in terms of taxation and government spending tends to wash out, although countries worry about this a lot. A second impact, potential impact, in terms of labor migration is a loss of knowledge benefits. What are we talking about here? Well, educated migrants, and some are educated, will take with them basically their education. And that is a loss to the home country, let's say Turkey, who's invested in those people, invested huge amounts in terms of their primary, secondary, and college education. So that is lost, and that is a cost that occurs to the home country in labor migration. Now, on the other hand, it's a benefit that accrues to the host country because they get the benefits without having paid for that education. There are other kinds of costs and issues that arise from labor migration. One is congestion, especially in a small country. If there's a wave of immigration, that can create problems for the social welfare system, for the infrastructure, and so forth. So that is a potential problem that comes with migration. And another is social friction. Certainly in the early 1990s in Europe, the wave of immigrants that came in from Eastern Europe to Western Europe created a lot of social tensions and problems within Western Europe. So that's another factor that one has to consider in talking about migration. Let's spend just a minute on two special cases that are worth highlighting in the case of labor migration. The first is the guest worker phenomenon. We mentioned this earlier. This is a situation in which workers go to another country for a limited period of time. This was a big phenomenon in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s in Europe. In fact, some countries like Switzerland, fully 1/3 of their workforce consisted of guest workers. The problem arises, though, is the moment a country like Switzerland starts to have an economic downturn, or recession, if you will, then they tend to ship many of these guest workers back, or would like to ship them back, to the home country. In effect, what they're trying to do is export their unemployment problem. Now, that's fine for Switzerland, but it creates a huge problem for the home countries, whether it's Turkey or Yugoslavia or Greece or wherever. So it's an issue, it's a problem that both the home and the host countries have been grappling with. So it's out there and has created a good deal of controversy. The other special case that's worthy of consideration is the brain drain. We talked about this a little bit earlier, and that especially when you have a very well-educated person who wants to leave. Let's say somebody who has a PhD in physics in India but wants to move and teach in a university in the United States. This can create some hardship for India, who's invested a huge amount in this physicist, not only education, but maybe setting up a research facility and so forth. So there tend to be not only hard feelings, but attempts to limit the kind of movement that can create this kind of brain drain. No satisfactory solution has been worked out in this kind of a situation on any kind of a worldwide basis, but it's still there as an issue. People have talked about, well, you know, the remittances from these high-powered people back to the home country offset some of the loss. True. People have talked about maybe limiting some of these kinds of movements. That tends to be counterproductive. But the point here is this is a special case, and it's an added sort of negative as we look at the movement of labor across international boundaries. So far, we have talked primarily about labor mobility. Let's shift gears and talk about capital mobility, and especially how it interlinks with labor mobility. And to illustrate some of the points here, we're going to now turn to our second case study, which looks at the experience of the Maquiladora program in Mexico.
Mexico, rich in history and culture, and rich in its people, almost 90 million of them, seemingly a gold mine for companies seeking plentiful sources of labor. But many Mexicans, unable to find good jobs in their own country, were looking for work across the border in the United States. The problem for the U.S., how to stem the flow of job-seeking Mexicans. The problem for Mexico, how to attract job-creating investment. What was keeping investment and jobs out of Mexico? Was there a way for Mexico to attract the good jobs that would encourage Mexican workers to look for work in Mexico? How could Mexico import investment? Mexico's resume as a host to employers looked ideal. It had ready supplies of energy, access to the huge consumer markets of the United States, and most important of all, a large labor force. But for years, much of Mexico's labor force sat idle, the result of policies that excluded job-creating foreign investment, policies followed by the governments of both Mexico and the United States. Mexican policies intended to protect against economic domination from abroad kept most foreign companies from establishing factories and creating jobs in Mexico, while U.S. policies, including job-protecting tariffs on imports from Mexico, also discouraged manufacturers from setting up shop south of the border. The result? Mexicans forced to look for work on the other side of the U.S. border. Was there a solution? One that would attract investment to Mexico and induce Mexican workers to look for work at home? The Maquiladora was one solution. Border factories in which Mexican workers assembled U.S.-made components for export with reduced tariffs to the American market. What did the Maquiladora offer to the two sides of the border? Patricia Fernandez-Kelly of the Johns Hopkins University's Institute for Policy Studies.
It's a twofold process which involves both Mexico opening its border originally only on an experimental basis and creating a free trade zone which would be an incentive for foreign companies to manufacture in Mexico. From the point of view of American companies, the interest was to be able to find more hospitable conditions of production, including lower wages, comparatively low wages, and also fewer impositions from the point of view of environmental protection, safety in workplaces, and other what they saw as bureaucratic impediments for production.
The maquiladoras started small, a few low-skill assembly operations. But by 1993, 2,000 maquiladoras were doing almost $6 billion worth of business, employing over 500,000 workers, workers who didn't need to cross the border to get a job. A partly open door had attracted investment and jobs to the border area. Could opening the door wider draw more investment and better jobs into the heartland of Mexico? Policies begun under Presidents Salinas and de la Madrid in the 1980s made Mexico more attractive to investment from abroad. Foreign ownership restrictions were loosened and government regulations were reduced. The result, a freshet of foreign investment. Companies like U.S.-based Cummins Engine, whose engine plant in San Luis Potosí, north of Mexico City, combined technology and training to produce one of the company's most productive facilities. Steve Nabel, president of Cummins Mexico.
We've built up a cadre of very experienced and expert people, and that's our most important asset. Our people are our most important asset. We've gone from pretty serious quality problems to achieving tolerances on our crankshaft machining line within 250 millionths of an inch. That's not bend and weld technology.
Mexico's new policy of openness to foreign investment had taken Mexico from the simple assembly work at the maquiladoras to the full production and high technology at Cummins. What did the trend signify for the Mexican economy?
A progressive movement toward further integration into the global economy. That's what is happening at present. The Maquiladora program then stands as the blueprint upon which many of these deregulatory and privatizing strategies are. And the purpose is to make Mexico more attractive for foreign investment.
Many Mexican workers still cross the U.S. border in search of better jobs. But the low-tech jobs at border maquiladoras and the high-tech jobs at Cummins San Luis Potosí plant were evidence that lowered barriers and less regulation could attract billions in investment and allow hundreds of thousands of workers to find jobs without leaving home. Evidence that paved the way for the gradual integration of Mexico into the continent-wide North American economy created in 1993 by the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Let's go back now to Australia and hear what our panelists have to say about this case study.
But we're talking about a large pool of labour, cheap labour. America itself had a lot of unskilled workers, unemployed workers. Why not use the people in America?
Well, there are usually a couple of reasons why that doesn't happen. One is that the jobs may be, for example, along the border, whereas the person who's unemployed is in New England may not want to move. So there are structural problems like that. Or there may be a skill difference that people really, there may be a auto worker unemployed in Detroit, for example, in the U.S., doesn't want to come down and assemble computers, would rather wait it out and get his sort of or her job in the auto industry back. So usually those are the kinds of constraints that get in the way of the unemployed taking the jobs in the, let's say, the maquiladora.
It may be said that, in a way, it may be said that maquiladoras was a first approach to NAFTA, the first attempt. And
North American.
North American to the North American Free Trade Agreement. But it was a less efficient approach in the sense that it was limited to a certain area, and it has some prerequisite that had to be accomplished in order to have the product going back to the United States and be taxed only on the value added. Then what we see now is that the free trade agreement, which allows now the companies to move anywhere in Mexico or in the United States, is a more efficient way of doing the same thing. And this is why all these partial attempts, we may say that they are positive in the sense that they show what the final aim may be and what are the benefits of free trade.
Before the North American Free Trade Agreement came along, though, wasn't there also an attempt in this whole project to keep Mexicans in Mexico?
Well, it's interesting you raised that, because President Salinas of Mexico put it very succinctly when he said to the Americans, in effect, you have two choices. You can import our goods, or you can import our people. And the part of the motivation behind the North American Free Trade Agreement was, in fact, to bring in Mexican goods, to help the Mexicans to have a really export-led growth, for Mexican incomes to rise and so forth, so that there would be less pressure for Mexicans to move to the U.S. So indeed, I mean, they're very related kinds of
Was
phenomena.
it successful, though?
Well, I think it was successful in, you may put a political sense on it. It was difficult, perhaps, when the Maquiladora program was introduced, for domestic political reasons, for Mexico to open up to trade generally. And what they were doing in this program was, in fact, getting some of the advantages of more open trade without exposing the economy of Mexico to the pressures of open trade, or in the government, to the political pressures that would have come from that on a more general basis. And so Mexico was essentially exporting what it had a comparative advantage in, and that is the use of fairly unskilled labor and fairly cheap labor in these products, and getting the gains that come from that, and therefore the gains to the Mexican workers, without opening up the economy to trade on a broader front. That came later when the political moment was appropriate in the North America Free Trade Agreement.
Do you think they saw that as the end goal, or it has developed along the way?
I suspect it developed along the way. These things emerged. They saw the gains that were coming from this trade, and that probably helped to educate or to bring the information to the people of the gains that were probably available on a much more widespread opening.
I think for a long time, Mexico was extremely wary and suspicious of the North American sort of neighbors, the U.S. basically, and I think very reluctant to go through this exercise of completely opening up. But in time, I think that changed, obviously, as they saw their fortunes very closely tied to the U.S. And that change took place sort of in the late 80s and early 1990s, especially after the U.S. and Canada signed their free trade agreement.
And so this is not just a question of labour, is it? Because we're seeing capital moving across borders as well in terms of investment.
It's definitely not only labor. I mean, they used to say in Mexico in the 70s that the problem with Mexico is that we are so close to the U.S. and so far from heaven. And in this case, it was, I think it's mainly the trade issues that this has brought about. I think that's the most important thing, because the capital, the foreign investment story was already told to the Mexicans, in the sense that the United States controlled almost half of Mexican manufacturing industry in the 70s. And a lot of labor had also moved over the frontier by that time. But trade, you see, that was the new thing. And that is the thing we have experienced now after the Maquiladora.
Gentlemen, thank you.
As we saw in the case study, capital moves to take advantage of low wages or preferential tax treatments. Let's look at the different kinds of capital that moves across international boundaries. And we've got a little chart here that shows us the different kinds of capital movements. There, at the top are two categories: official capital flows and non-official capital flows. Official refers to government flows of capital. This is, let's say, movements by a government that, as it's trying to stabilize its currency. But we'll focus primarily on the non-government private flows of capital. They tend to break down into two areas: long-term, short-term. Again, the short-term capital flows usually relate to exchange rate movements, some of it speculative, some of it just hedging and so forth. But we'll focus on the long-term and the two the two categories of long-term capital movements, because they affect much more the fundamental economics that are going on. The first is portfolio investment, and the second is direct. And let's see if we can understand what's going on in each of these kinds of investment. Portfolio investments are basically investments either in a stock market overseas or in a mutual fund that invests in the stock markets overseas. And usually the motivation here is to look for higher rates of return, or sometimes investors are looking to diversify their portfolios. Instead of putting all their eggs in one basket, they will try to spread it around the world. So that can be another motivation for portfolio investment. Now, portfolio investment, usually there's a disconnect between the investor and the activity at the end, whereas the second type of investment, international investment and international capital flows, is more directed. Direct investment usually involves, let's say, a company investing in, buying, or building a factory overseas. And this very much relates to their corporate operations. It's motivated by a number of reasons. One, to exploit a particular kind of capability or particular kind of technology. And this often is the motivation behind foreign direct investment. A second is to exercise greater control over foreign sources of materials and markets, or as in the case of the maquiladora example, to take advantage of low wages or even preferential tax arrangements. And then finally, this kind of direct investment often is set up to circumvent trade barriers, tariff barriers. For example, in the 1980s, many Japanese companies moved auto assembly plants to Europe because they were very worried that the European community was going to create a fortress Europe, basically build tariff walls around Europe. Similarly, in the 1980s, many Japanese companies like Honda and Toyota began to build plants, what they were called transplants, in the U.S. as they became worried about the voluntary export restraints that the U.S. was asking Japan to indulge in. So this was a way to circumvent those voluntary export restraints and meet the U.S. demand for Japanese autos by producing autos in the U.S. And in fact, while we're on the topic of direct foreign investment into the U.S., we can see here on this graph that goes from 73 to 89 that not only, as it turns out, is the U.S. investing, U.S. corporations investing abroad, but a lot of investment money has come into the U.S., and we can see overall this graph has been trending upward, although there are a lot of bumps and squiggles on it. But indeed what it suggests, and if we looked at graphs for other countries, it would suggest that foreign direct investment is growing very rapidly and it's becoming a major force in the international economy. Now, let's look at the impact of foreign investment and of capital flows in general. Who wins, who loses? Certainly the owners of the capital in the home country, the country that's exporting the capital, let's say the U.S. exporting capital to Mexico, the owners of that capital benefit because typically they get higher rates of return by investing their capital overseas. When we look at the worker impact, there it's mixed, because what you have is that certainly the home country workers feel that by exporting capital overseas, many companies are also exporting jobs, because by taking their money overseas, building a factory overseas, they're in effect exporting jobs. Whereas the host country, the country that's receiving the investment, is happy to take it because usually with it comes jobs, and there's job creation that follows the investment. Now, much in the same way that labor mobility benefited the world as a whole, if you remember in the example we had earlier of Mexico and the U.S. and labor mobility, we saw that on net the U.S. and Mexico benefited, and of course the world as a whole benefited. The same thing can be said about capital mobility, insofar as if capital is allowed to move freely across national borders, it tends to find the most efficient use, not just the highest return, but the most efficient use. And this clearly is very beneficial, not only for the host and home countries, but for the world economy as a whole. So if we look at the bottom line, though, and say, okay, what can we say about capital and labor mobility? And in fact, it resembles, many of the results and impacts resemble very much the impact of trade. To begin with, trade, as in the case of labor and capital mobility, produce winners and losers, and we've seen that in the examples that we've used. However, it also results, the movement of labor and capital, also results in a much more efficient use of resources because, again, it's allowed to find, we allow the market to find the most efficient use of both labor and capital. And finally, the net impact on the whole world is very positive. So like trade, the free movement of capital and labor benefits the world as a whole. For Inside the Global Economy, this is Annenberg.
Annenberg Media. For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.